PK here. Thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of the E Word. E as in emulation, the dirtiest word in the retro gaming community. On this segment of the E Word, I'm going to talk about the rise of legal or official emulation. I might be beating a dead horse here. I've touched on this subject in my ROMs and emulators video, as well as my PS1 retrospect. But I really want to go into greater detail about this subject and inform people who might not know. Also, I thought this would be a nice way to cap off the E-Word trilogy and show people another side of the subject of emulation. Quite often, morally gray, questionably legal emulation has a bit of a stigma around it, whereas the Wii Virtual Console, the PlayStation Store, and Xbox Live don't have this problem. The reason is obvious. They're distributed by legitimate companies. And it's not just the online stores, sometimes it's the very hardware itself. A great example of this would be the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 is not natively backwards compatible with original Xbox games. This is achieved through emulation. The PS3 is a little more complicated. PS3s do use emulation to play PS1 games, but the original 60 gig PS3s had built-in PS2 graphics and CPU hardware. When the later 80 gig 4-port PS3s were released, such as this one, they used emulation to achieve PS2 backwards compatibility. This was probably a lot cheaper and more cost-effective. One of the other popular forms of using emulation by companies is using physical emulation. Many companies have issued old games on 6th and 7th gen consoles. Midway and Atari have done a lot of this. Before the Virtual Console, Nintendo did a lot of physical emulation. They would put NES games on Game Boy Advance carts, basically. You get the classic, like Legend of Zelda and Mario. Whether you like emulation or not, you've probably played it in some way, shape, or form. The major difference is playing games legally supports the developers. Well, if you buy this as new physical copies or buy any type of digital download, whether it's DLC or the game itself. I'm not even going to go into how I feel about DLC. That's a video for another day. A great example of why I love that Sega ports every Sonic game to just about every platform is this. I have a Sega CD. I see Sonic CD every so often and never see it for a price I'm willing to pay, unfortunately. Sonic CD can be easily downloaded on the PlayStation Network for $5. Some people might say it's not the same as playing it on an actual Sega CD. They're probably right, but I don't know that. I've never had the opportunity to play it on an actual Sega CD because, let's face it, the Sega CD isn't the best-selling Sega platform of all time by any means. And the games aren't quite as common as the Genesis and Mega Drive games. For a guy who has no personal nostalgia for this game, it's not a big deal. A lot of people might feel differently, and that's great too. Speaking of Sega, believe it or not, there was a time when emulators, not just the ROMs themselves, very legality had come into question. A company known as Bleem had created emulator software that would allow people to play original PlayStation games on their PC. They even came out with 3 emulator boot-up discs for the Dreamcast. One of those being Metal Gear Solid. All I have to do is put this disc in, have it start up, take it out, and I put a copy of Metal Gear Solid 1 in, and I can play it on my Dreamcast. The minute Bleem started taking pre-orders for the new PlayStation emulator software, Sony filed a lawsuit within 2 days. Sony alleged that they were violating their rights and giving people access to PlayStation games to run on non-Sony hardware, and this was unfair competition. At the end, Bleem actually won in court, and a protective order was issued to, and I quote, "protect David from Goliath," end quote. Sony lost on all counts, including Bleem using actual screenshots of PS games on their packaging. The court said that Bleem's use of copyrighted screenshots was considered fair use and should be allowed to continue. In spite of Bleem's victory, they ended up going out of business, mostly because of the money they spent in court fees. It was sadly a Pyrrhic victory for Bleem. Ironically, 2 of the guys who worked there went on to work for Sony. If Sony had actually beat Bleem, I wonder how it would have affected emulation in other forms. Would this have set a precedence? Would Sony and Nintendo and so many other companies have ever made so many ports of games if they had realized how much demand was there for their back catalog of games? It's hard to say. It might have happened later than sooner. I think official emulation could be a great thing. It helps us continue to play a lot of our old games on newer and different systems. It helps us preserve games we have physical copies of, and even saves space. Most importantly, it helps us introduce these tried and true classics to a new generation, and even people who are just getting into gaming. Whether you're a digital gamer or a physical gamer or both, I think we can all agree retro gaming is awesome, no matter how it's played. Please comment below with how you feel about the subject of official emulation. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching and keep on gaming.